Hi, Roni.
Of course, I'm on mute when I say hi. How are you?
Can you hear me? Everything's good?
Yeah. Thank you so much I know how valuable time is when I think you're on a deadline too, aren't you, for your third book?
Yeah, I am. But you know what? I have been writing nonstop lately, which is amazing. And so a little break is definitely good. So it's all good. I was looking forward to this.
Score?
You know what? I know I read parts of that. I think I had to read that book for the second book that I wrote. Weirdly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating too.
Yeah.
And that takes place 16 years later, right?
So yeah, it opens about 16 years later, and then it jumps ahead 5 more years. The three, yeah, for the most part, like they're about 20 years apart. To my way of thinking, they would be completely new stories. Like I didn't want, on the day that the book ended, poor Violet the next day to all over again have to go through some trauma or whatever. So I thought, it's sort of interesting for me, I think, to see these characters at different stages in their lives.
Okay. Yeah,
so
I get that totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I also noticed that they're 2 years apart in publishing, 2014, 2016.
I had the second book written before the first one got published. So it seems like, oh, she wrote another book 2 years later. No, I had the rough draft of that second book finished. The first book was rejected a whole bunch.
Okay.
Like 20, 30 times. I put it in a drawer. I wrote the second book.
You answered one of my questions.
Oh, okay.
No, that's good.
Kaylee woke up one night, I have no idea why, and it hit her something I needed to do to restructure the first book. It took me about 6 months to a year to do that, and then that's when it got published. So yeah, it looks like I'm a faster writer than I am.
So I wrote about two sisters, but mostly because I have a relationship with my sister that's a little contentious. Do you have any of that, or was this just more spawned from the idea of Pearl and Janet?
Originally it was spawned from that relationship, Pearl and Janet, because that's the story that I heard growing up. When I finished the first book and looked back on it, I realized, oh my God, that's my sister. Oh my God, that's me. Different parts of the book, things that I didn't even realize I put in there. My nephew has a bone disease. He's doing well now, but he's in his late 30s. He breaks his bones very easily. That's been sort of a trauma for the whole family. And my sister went through a whole lot of suffering because of his, everything going on for him. He's broken over 100 bones. I mean, it's just been, and so I didn't even realize I put her in there. I mean, she was Grace grieving,
Wow.
with a child, but I didn't consciously do that in the first book. In the second book, I definitely infused more of our relationship. Although we have a decent relationship, that book, they don't.
So when you wrote Sing in the Morning, Cry in the Night, did you have plans to turn it into a series or a sequel?
No. So that first book, like, I had no sense that it was going to be part of a trilogy. And boy, did that lock me into some things. Even now, as I'm writing the third book, like I have a character who has a physical, I don't want to give it away to you if you're going to read, but he has a physical disability of some sort. And like he's still in the third book, and I keep forgetting that he has this issue,
So now I'm curious, because you didn't plan either for that when you were writing the first book. However, you have something unique in that it wasn't published yet, so you could go back and change it, right? I don't know if you did, but when you started writing or drafting the second book, your first book wasn't published yet.
You're right that the book wasn't published, but here's the weird thing, and I never thought of this. It never occurred to me to go back and change it. I wrote that second book based on what I wrote in that first book. Now, when Kaylee told me to rewrite the first book, it was all about, I started originally the book on the day the little girl was baptized, and then later there's the accident, and then there's her funeral, and all of that was up front. And Kaylee said, no, you have to start. Part 2 started 2 months later. And she said, you have to get rid of that whole first section, first 100 pages, and start 2 months later. But then all of that you got rid of, you need to cut it all up and drop it in as flashback throughout the book. I feel really good about the start to the book. I don't know how or why, but I settled on that chorus of church women who would speak as one. So they sort of speak about the events that are going on in the town, and then, you know, they're just sort of sprinkled every 5 or 6 chapters. And it worked for me. That was a great vehicle for making the town a character, you know, and kind of giving that sense of what the people were like. I also did the same thing in the second book because it's a trilogy. And I liked what I did there. And then the third book came along. And part of my struggle with the third book for a good year was that format was not working. Trying to force that chorus and force the same techniques. But, you know, it's 1955, it's the same family. They're going through, of course, you know, different problems. But there was also this story that kept haunting me about this woman in 1916. Totally different woman. My characters are Welsh, they're white. This is a Black woman in 1916. And I kept thinking, okay, that's another novel. Like, there's no connection here. And about a year later, I found the connection. And once I gave myself permission to let go of that form, the book started coming. So, you know, on one hand, yeah, it's a trilogy, so you want some consistency. On the other hand, they are separate works and
they stand alone.
Stand alone. You know, the first book has a character named Grief, and people loved Grief. It was a way to describe Grace's breakdown in 1913 without using the terminology that we might use today for a breakdown. And they couldn't wait for the second book because they wanted to see what Grief was up to. And I didn't put him in there. So you have to do what's best for the books.
So what I was going to ask, and you already answered it, I think, what was your approach to writing the second book and now the third? And I think you tried to have the same approach in the third book, but you had to find a different way. Sounds like it.
Yeah, and here was the problem too. The second book, I told you I had a draft written before the first one came out. Now, I still had to rewrite it. I had work to do, but the book was essentially written. The third book is the first time I'm really writing a book with anybody out there having expectations of me, because, you know, the first book did well, but the second book was already written for the most part. And so other than letting Grief go, you know, I didn't have those expectations. Now I do. And I think that's, you know, you have to somehow figure out how to let those go and just write the story that needs to be written.
Right.
I don't know.
I forget what
the first book is historical fiction because that's when that story needed to be told. I did not start the program thinking, oh, I'm a historical fiction writer. I don't gravitate toward historical fiction. I gravitate toward a good story. It could be set in the present, the past, the future. It's about characters for me. It's about story. So that was, you know, that just, honestly, you know how you show up for that semester where you have to do the speed dating and you have to pitch your novel? I was so busy leading up to that, I forgot I was supposed to be thinking about what I wanted to write about. So the night before, I kind of panicked and I'm thinking, what am I going to write? And that story about my Aunt Pearl's death kept coming to me. And I thought, well, all right, I'll use that. And also, my grandmother used to talk about being born during the Billy Sunday snowstorm, which was in 1914. Billy Sunday, a famous evangelist, came to town and everyone was snowed in. And by morning, they were all saved because he was so charismatic, you know.
Oh,
and this,
wow.
yeah, you all, like, even today, people in Scranton will say, oh yeah, my great uncle was saved at the Billy, you know, that's, and so I knew those two things, and that's all I had when I went to pitch. but that meant it ended up being historical fiction. So moving forward, I had to write historical fiction because Chris said they're going to want three, if a publisher is going to commit to you, they're going to want 3 books in the same genre. My process is organic. Chris told me this. I never realized this. There are people who outline. I do not. I go to the computer every day to see what's going to happen next. I don't know. And so sometimes that research, throws me in a whole other direction. It actually, serves the story. So, and it takes it in a new place.
I'm curious on any pieces of backstory, the land in the second book, and your approach to how do you make sure these books go together but still stand alone?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, for example, there's the running thread of the trauma of the death of this little girl. So every book I have to talk about the death of the little girl. First of all, I give enough so that, I can say to you, oh, that poor family, they had a child who died when she was 8 years old. Her dress caught on fire with a sparkler and she died. And that's enough. You get it. So you don't have to go in, if you really want the whole story, read the first book is kind of what I in my head. The other thing that I've been playing with is I tell the story from somebody else's point of view. And it's not always the same story because we remember things differently. In the second book, somebody ends up at the Good Shepherd Infant Asylum and brings home a baby. And it was a big scandal in the family. You didn't get pregnant. You didn't when you were unmarried, the whole thing. And yet in this newest book, when the mother is talking to the daughter who came home with the baby, she's talking to her about how brave she was. And I knew you'd come home with that baby when I sent you there. Well, that's not true. But that's the story the mother tells herself now, because you don't want to say you didn't want that grandchild, but she tells enough of the real story that a new reader is going to get what happened. Oh, she came home with that baby. And then for the regular reader, the one who's already read, it's like, Grace is fibbing a little here. She knew she did. Like, hopefully, is that the reader is rewarded with, oh, look at this, she's misremembering. And then you wonder who's telling the truth, and that's okay too, because nobody's version of events is 100% accurate. So that's what I play with when I'm retelling those stories.
Okay, sounds great too.
I'm looking, I wrote a note about that. I just want to make sure if I just said, remember, you already told the story. If it needs to be told again, tell it briefly and or differently.
Oh,
I will tell you, and I don't have children, but I always, they talk about books as your children. Honestly, every book has been a different process. Every one. And that sort of at the beginning of each book, it's like, wait, do I know how to do this? Because each book came to me differently.
well, that's interesting. Okay.
Third book, honestly, and I talked to Chris and Kaylee about this over the years. I was really, I wrote those other 2 books when I was teaching full time and my dad was dying and I was taking care of him and I was so busy. And now I'm retired from teaching and I have all this time and I couldn't get the third book. It was just like, oh my God, like pulling teeth to get words on the page. I really do blame part of it in just the funk of what was and still to some degree is going on in the world, but also my resistance to, oh, this is a different kind of a book. I resisted it. I resisted it because I think there was a part of me that thought the reader wouldn't accept it. And I can't predict what the reader will like or not. I just have to write from my heart.
Yeah.
So
they do kind of write themselves, you know what I mean, once you get going. So when you say you use primary resources, have you ever interviewed anybody that has lived through that directly?
Yes.
Has that been helpful to you?
It has been. Here's where the interviews have been helpful. So it's for those little details you're not going to find anywhere else. When I was writing the second book, Scranton is famous for prostitution. We had a thriving, prostitution industry here from the early 1900s into the 70s. Babe Ruth used to come here, sleep with the women, and go have spaghetti at a famous restaurant. Like, people would come to Scranton. So I wanted to know more about the prostitution because I was putting a prostitute in my second book. And my dad was in his 80s. My mom had died by then. And he was a Mason, some fraternal organization, bunch of white men, old white men. And I went with him to one of their dinners as his date. And I was sitting there thoroughly bored. And I looked around the table and I thought, all of these men are in their 80s. And I just said, so, can anybody here tell me anything about prostitution in the 1930s? And there was a man there who started laughing. He and his brother used to run errands for the women downtown.
Oh, wow.
And I found out from him, I found out a lot, but they used to put chicken wire over the windows so the men couldn't sneak in and sneak out of the bawdy houses. They were called bawdy houses. Oh, so wow. The women would slip dimes through the chicken wire to this guy and his brother, and they'd go get them Texas wieners up the road and bring the food back to them and all that. That's a detail you're only going to get by interviewing somebody. I mean, my friends and family, they now understand. I will just randomly ask the weirdest questions, but
so cool.
The other night I was having dinner in Wilkes-Barre, and somebody, I don't know, somehow we found out that the couple next to us, the guy grew up in Southside, and I immediately, hey, were you around for the flood? Hurricane Diane in 55. And next thing you know, I have my chair pulled up and I'm writing down everything he's saying. So I had to take classes as a teacher, and I accidentally ended up in a class, fiction for writers.
Oh, wow.
Thought it was just a fiction class. And when I found out I had to write a short story for the class, I thought, oh, I'm getting out of here. And then I thought, I feel scared, but it's like that good scared feeling I haven't had in a long time. So I stayed in the class. I did everything. I wrote the story. And on the last day, she pointed to me. I was just sitting in the back of the room reading a book. And she said, you need to find a writing program, an MFA program, when you get back to Pennsylvania. And the next day, the flyer from Wilkes showed up in my Memphis mail.
Oh my God, that gave me chills. Like, it's totally meant to be, right?
And I had a writing sample to send them because I had written a short story for class.
Yeah.
I always wanted to be a writer, but I never knew writers. I didn't know I could be a writer. Like, I didn't know that was even possible. I don't know where the inspiration comes from, and I just say thank you when it comes. But I'm amazed when like, now that I'm writing the third book, and it's like, oh, that's why that happened in the second book. Okay, that's good. I can use that.
Yeah, you didn't. But do you ever have any moments when you're writing now that you wish you could go back and change something so you could make this book different? Or is it just is what it is?
It is what it is. I actually, like, at most, I just laugh at myself. I'm just going to say it. I don't want to ruin the book, but somebody loses a hand. And it's like, son of a bitch, why did I do that? Like, now I have to go back and remember he can't clap his hands. He doesn't have two hands. All right.
Oh, yeah.
I painted myself into that corner, but no, there's nothing.
You have to go back and read it sometimes, probably, right?
Pardon?
You have to go back and read it sometimes just to make sure.
You know what? It's funny. I have them both on Kindle, and so I use the search feature a lot. It's like, oh, did I use this last name? Oh, did I? How old was he when this happened? And so I just search. I don't go back and reread them, but I search that way. I mull over every single word I write so much that for the most part, I'm at least stopping myself to put a note saying, check this, even if I don't check it. That's not to say it's perfect, but it's worked for me for it worked for me for the second book, hopefully. Plus, once the book goes, now Chris will read it, who, by the way, is a great reader. So try everything she suggested.
God, she gave me the best notes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I told her when I met her, I'm like, you have a really good eye. Like she has a sharp.
Oh, she's so Chris will read it, Kaylee will read it, you know, somebody at Akashic will read it. So people will read this, other people will read it who have read the other two books. So hopefully we'll catch any of those continuity errors. I knew that these girls were going to start out at the Good Shepherd Infant Asylum in Philadelphia. I knew one of them was going to have a baby. So I needed to research what the medical procedures would be for giving birth in 1930. You know, what would they do back then? How, you know, what drugs would they give? Whatever. And I bought several books on eBay. I always buy books that are falling apart. You know, it's not about like, I just need the information. I'm not a collector. So, you know,
Yeah.
you can. And one day I realized that each of those books was published by the American Eugenics Society.
Oh.
Wait, what? The medical books from that time. And so I started digging and I realized long before Hitler in World War II, we were really the, you know, the ones that were promoting eugenics. We had at the county fairs, the fittest family contest, and it was to see which white family was the best. We were promoting this from, you know, Protestant ministers from the pulpits. The Catholics weren't doing it because they didn't believe in abortion, but you know, this was a movement. And so that suddenly went into my book. I didn't know it was going to be part of the story till I did that research. I started that book knowing that there was going to be a baby born out of wedlock, and knowing that these girls were, you know, going to be sent away. So Philadelphia made sense to me.
Well, you don't outline books, so you already answered that. You didn't outline the series, but you've had this working idea. And it's interesting. It sounds like you have a sense of it though before you go into it. Like, here's where I want these people to go, and here's where it might end. The ending usually writes itself though, don't you think? Have you struggled with your endings?
They do write themselves. I hit about the 2/3 mark and panic and think, this is not going to happen. And there's a really good book, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
Oh, I love that book.
Oh,
I love Stephen Pressfield.
Yeah,
Pressfield, whatever his name is. He wrote
Yeah.
Legend of Bagger Vance or whatever it is.
Yeah. And he always talks about there is this point with resistance where you get to a book and you just think it's awful, it's not going anywhere, the whole thing. And I feel that every time I get to about 2/3, 3/4, and then something happens and it opens up again, and it comes like it's coming now. So
Your love of research, you seem to have a love of research. Did you do that before as an English teacher, or
I mean, I taught research for research papers, that sort of thing. But no. And I will say, I think there are two kinds of historical fiction writers. Some people get into it because they love the history, and this is a way to use the history.
right?
That's not me. I use the history to serve the story. So I get in, I get out. Like if I need to know, you know, the names of, I was writing about a neighborhood in Scranton, and I needed to know what some of the stores were that were there in 1955. And as soon as I found the names of 3 or 4, it was like, okay, I'm good, and back out. Now, other people would stay there and read those articles, and it would lead to another article and another rabbit hole. And that'll happen once in a while, but for the most part, I'm in and out. I think helps me to avoid those info dumps where you're just so taken up with the process of how that fabric is made. You're sure the reader is going to want to know every detail, and the reader doesn't.
Right.
As I'm retelling some stories, you know how you have to retell, we talked about that, like I'm retelling the death of the child. I drop it in at different places. I don't just tell the whole thing at once. And my manuscript, every time I drop a detail in about the death of Daisy, I highlight it in green. There's another story that I'm dropping in, I highlight it in yellow. That way I can go back as a writer and read all the green and see if I've given the reader all the details they need. by the time the book is finished.
So it's like peppering it in, so it's not all at once, but it's in there. That's a very good tool.
And I've only started doing that recently, so I wanted to tell you that. Oh, and the other thing that I've started doing with this book intentionally is echoes of trauma and echoes of the events. So it's not happening to the granddaughter the exact same way, but if you read the first or the second book, you might be rewarded with, oh, that's kind of like something her mother did, but it turned out this way. You know, those, I mean, you know, trauma is generational. Like in my family, literally, my Aunt Pearl was playing with a sparkler. Her dress caught on fire. She died 3 days later. So that was 1908. It's 2021, and we're still afraid of fireworks in my family.
Oh, that's a really good detail. That's
Yeah.
a really good, like,
So my cousin, who's younger than I am and has little kids, said to me, is it weird that I won't let the kids play with sparklers? Like, no, that's, you know, that's, yeah. And I mean, I never knew the little girl who died. So you want to see that echoed, even if they don't understand why they're doing it.
yeah.
The reader will know that it's, yeah. The only other thing I would say to you is if you want your books to stand alone, make sure you have somebody read the second book who's never read the first book. Always make sure you get somebody to look at it so they can say, wait, what's going on here? Because you might assume the reader will know something. So
Right.
I always find somebody I trust who hasn't read the other books.
That's a really good point. Alone.
There you go.
I think yours do. I already looked at the beginnings of both of them. Like they totally stand alone.
Yeah. For me, I think it's also easier because they're 20 years apart. So, you know.
Yeah, mine's only going to be a year apart, so I need to be careful.
Yeah. But you can do it. You'll be able to do it. Yeah. Really, it's all about the story and it's in service to the story. So if it'll add to it, great. Otherwise, if it's just you going off on a tangent about politics or whatever, you know, it gets cut. Yeah.
I would never do that. Well, very cool. Well, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
You're anytime. All right.
All right. Take care. Happy writing out there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right now. Bye-bye.
Bye.